welcome everyone. Thank you for being with us here today for the Regenerative Communities Plenary. My name is Jess Alvarez-Parfrey, I'm Programs Director with Transition US, and I'll be one of your co-hosts for this session. I will also be working with the wonderful Alisa Miles. Hi, Alisa. Alisa, we have about 84 people here with us. I just wanted to share, and Alisa has asked that we all know that she is mostly blind. So if there's any way to be very descriptive in your language, I also want to look to things in the chat that I can share with Alisa so we can all have an inclusive experience here today. All right, so we're going to get started with a little bit of housekeeping and take a look at some agreements that we have set up for our time together during the Regenerative Community Summit, which is ongoing from September 24th through October 9th. If we can take a look at those, Dawn is our amazing tech host for this session. We have some other support folks from Transition US with us here today so we can have a great experience. A note, we are dealing with Zoom and technology, so bumps may happen. So we thank you so much for your patience and your grace during this time together.
Welcome, everybody. We'll open with a poem that was written collaboratively by many transitioners. Here it is. Earth-centered, roots, mycelium, mushrooms, forests, sharing resources. Power relations and power structures impact our relationships to the earth and to each other. Reconnection, hearts. We need to see and recognize exploitation and extraction for what it is. No fear of death, toxic expressions of power, desire for control of the future. No replacement for our relationships we have, who we know, who we are. There is no model or template that can be imposed. Specificity, honoring unique contexts. Community life cannot be standardized. No cult of capitalism, hegemonic order. Texture, attuned and open, curiosity, and deep exploration. The body is the place to begin healing, to begin integrating. Life is not a resource to be tapped. All life is source. All life is source, its own being. Textures of relationship, reciprocity, regeneration, life way. Earth as teacher. There is no one perfect model. Nature is a celebration of difference. Biodiversity, poetic expression that invites as opposed to declaring. The texture of our bodies, complexity contained within the body of the earth, of beings large and small. Audre Lorde, our feelings give us the truth. Journey, what did you find along the way? What gifts have spoken your name? Conditions of safety, of creativity. If our work in the movement is done well, it brings us home to ourselves, to our bodies, to our relationship to each other, to all beings, to the earth, to who we are. What is the power that we believe in? Flowing in relationship across time, healing across generations, a power that can hold the fear of death, that can withstand the urge for domination. It is a power that is rooted in the source of life, transformational, leveling up together, bringing all my relations with me, celebration of differences, not toxic monocultures, not world denying, earth defiling, power of divergence without fragmentation, and power of dissent without alienation. Peace back.
Thank you, Alisa, for sharing that creative invocation. We wanted to set the tone off for this panel in an expansive way. I want to be sure to greet and absolutely thank our panelists, Thaisa Matos, the Global Eco Village Network, author Daniel Christian Wall joining us from Mallorca. It's quite late where he is, so thank you again. And we have Olivia Benson representing the Forbes Funds. And again, thank you all for being with us here today. We're hoping to have a really authentic and engaging conversation. So to do that, we wanted to do a little bit of framing. We had an absolutely beautiful opening ceremony yesterday. Raise your hand if you were with us last evening for the opening ceremony. Wonderful. If you were not able to be there with us, we will have a recording available. So look for that on the Mighty Network site, our Regenerative Communities portal. We spent some time talking about regeneration. We spent some time exploring this concept and really unpacking what it means. And in this conversation around regenerative communities, we want to take a look at how can we truly commit to building life-affirming, healing spaces that honor all people across differences. We don't have time to waste. We have to be with each other. We have to tap into our collective gifts and skills now more than ever. So this is why this summit is very special and important. And again, we thank you all for bringing all that you have to offer here. We want this to be interactive. We want you to feel seen, and we want you to feel like you have a community behind you, because again, we need each other now more than ever. So I'm going to pass it over to Elisa to see if you would like to add any thoughts about what we're trying to do here today and throughout the summit.
We are really honored to have this time together where we can all really create together what regeneration means, what it looks like at a community level, and what each of our roles are in that. And also, we really hope that this is a place for us to connect across movements from different places around the country, around the world, and to get to know each other and be inspired together by the wonderful work that's happening. We can start off with some introductions so we can all get to know our delightful panelists. And the question that we will start with is to each of you panelists, Olivia, Thaisa, and Daniel, how would you introduce yourself to a child born a few generations in the future?
Imagine that time travel is possible and you're greeting this child in this timeline. How would you introduce yourself, Olivia?
I think I'd start off with hi and hope that that worked. I would introduce myself as someone who generations ago was inspired by those that came from generations before me, to think about what the future will look like and how I wanted and how I worked hard to make ideally this child's experience one that is equitable and just. I'd also apologize for what they would see me as wearing, because I imagine it would be very out of style and hopefully not too terrible.
Wonderful. Thank you for that answer, Olivia. Thaisa,
what if this child, Jessica, I want to say, what if this child said to Olivia, what did you do back then? Who were you? What was your life like?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I would tell this child that I was a parent. I am raising a child was raising a child during a global pandemic. I challenged power structures because I think that the power structures that are in place are dismissive and constantly put down communities of color. And I would say that I really was an excellent cook, and they wouldn't be able to judge that. So I'm telling you all now that's false. But this child, I'd want them to think that I was an excellent cook.
Thank you.
love it.
How about you, Thaisa?
Let's see, how can I introduce myself? I would also start with a hello, and maybe I would tell this child that I have a very interesting story to tell about that crazy time that I lived many, many years ago, when people were so crazy that they were destroying this amazing world. They tried hard, but I was part of a movement where we were building communities all over and supporting ourselves. So we managed to thrive. I'm Brazilian. I have been in many communities and eco villages around, and yeah, I have so many inspiring stories to share. And I think that's it for now. I'm calling from Rio, and very much looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Taisa. And Daniel, how would you introduce yourself to a child born a few generations in the future?
I would say, hello, I'm a very curious person. I have a habit of asking questions. So I'm going to just keep asking you questions, but if you ever get bored by it, then stop me and ask me some. So rather than telling the child who I was, I will ask questions to understand where the child was, in order to then be able to judge what the child might actually know about me, want to know about me. And the very fact that that child is still there already would give me hope that we made it through the great transformation that is now in the middle of really kicking off in the next decade or so. And I'm calling from Mallorca, and yes, somebody mentioned it already, it's after 10 o'clock here, so you might just witness seeing me turn into a pumpkin. Don't worry if there's just a big pumpkin on the screens at some point. It's me. Right, that's me for now.
Wonderful. I have another question. So my question would be, when did you realize that you were in this world to create change? What keeps you going? Where are you headed in your work? And we'll take that question over to you, Taisa.
Oops. Yeah, I think I was in my early 20s when I realized that I was just very different from most of my friends. Like, most of the people were willing to find a good job and buy a car, build a house, or build family. And I was just like trying to do something different, because from my eyes, that was not the way forward. So I just like gave up my job at that time, and I started to travel around. And when I got to know the Eco Village movement, I remember the first time I heard about it in the year 2000. And then when I did my first Eco Village training in 2004, it completely changed my life. And since then, I've been like just exploring and working together and co-creating communities and studying it at the university, and yes, spreading the word. I think that's my main inspiration, when I can see like that there is another way of living. It's much more fun. It can be sustainable, and yeah. So I don't really understand why people are still doing the old when there are so many other possibilities.
Thank you, Taisa. I'll take the question over to you, Olivia. When did you realize you were in this world to create change? What keeps you going, and where are you headed in your work?
Yeah, let's see. I'll try and answer those in reverse. Like, I think I'm headed where I'm called, if that makes sense. I think I'm very grateful to be in the company of folks that often are thinking similar to me. But I realize that change happens sometimes on the fringes, and being in those spaces where you might be the only person that is thinking like you doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be the only one moving forward that thinks that way. I would also point out that I realized at some point when I was having conversations with other folks and talking to them, a lot of my work was centered in the we versus the I. So it was what I want us to accomplish and how we can do these things versus myself as a person, building widgets and going to the next widget machine. So I think that was what happened. And it never was a dawning moment for me. Nothing just simply snapped, but it was just taking a step back and practicing what I was preaching and thinking about the ecosystems where I existed with this we mindset and seeing the progress that those places were making in at least the conversation really did center me in doing this work.
Thank you for that. I think that point about ecosystems is going to be a reoccurring theme that we address during the session and throughout the summit. And I'll go over to you, Daniel, and ask you the same question. When did you realize, if you had a distinct moment, that you were here to create change? What keeps you going, and where are you headed in your work?
I think very early on in my life, because I grew up in Munich, Germany, and in the 70s and 80s, that was sort of the hotspot for the Cold War, where all the nuclear arsenal of the world was pointing, and all the battle plans for World War III, where Germany was the battlefield. And when I was 11, I kind of began to realize that that's where I was living. And so you begin to question what kind of a humanity is this, if that is a real possibility. And it's also the time that then a bit later Chernobyl happened, and in Germany there was a lot of acid rain, so a lot of the forests were dying. So I got into activism quite early, when 15, 16, working, like giving talks about Greenpeace and Amnesty International. But then I also fell asleep at university for probably about 6 or 7 years, not really caring about any of this and wanting to be a marine biologist. But then I had a key moment, realizing that I could spend my entire life studying whales and dolphins, and that they would probably go extinct, and my grandchildren would probably only know them from some kind of video or recording. And that's really another, that was almost like a moment, like a kind of flash, an insight. I don't want to be a marine biologist anymore. I want to work with my species in order, because I can help the whales and the dolphins better that way. So yeah, that was a key moment in my life.
Thank you, Daniel. And I'm going to pass it over to you, Elisa, to see if you have any questions you'd like to ask to our panelists next.
Sure. What do each of you believe makes a community regenerative? I know some of you have worked in and seen many different communities where sometimes things may have worked well and other times maybe things have not worked so well. And so what have you seen that really stands out to you, that works, that holds fast, that lasts, and that you believe really is regenerative? Let's start with you, Daniel.
Now, that's a very interesting question. I had a couple of conversations. There's a guy who's, I think, coming to the Hangout session after this session, Christopher Chase, where I run this Facebook page, Ecological Consciousness, with. And we had a very interesting conversation around this term about regenerative community, what it actually means. And that was the first time that in that conversation, I realized, yeah, it's the basic structure of life. And then very shortly afterwards, I spoke with Fritjof Capra, and Fritjof Capra wrote this amazing book, The Systems View of Life. And really his personal conclusion was that there it is. Thank you, Galen. And basically his conclusion was that life is structured as a nested regenerative community across scales. Life is a planetary process that makes this planet more inhabitable for more life. And our role is to fit into this larger community that is life evolving. That's what regeneration is about. And of course, the place where we have the most agency to do so is in a community that is rooted in place, and not just rooted in place, but is actually an expression of place. And so I think it would help us, rather than to try to say regenerative community is the new kid on the block and now we all want a piece of it, and what's a regenerative community, is to actually reframe it and say, no, regenerative community is the basic pattern of life. And what we've unlearned by not listening to our indigenous elders for far too long is how to fit into that pattern. And we've fallen out of it so much that we now need to refit modern technological Homo sapiens, what an arrogant self-naming, into the community of life again. And so, yeah, for me, it's a much bigger thing than just a pretty eco-village, which are also experimental places to learn how to do this, not in any way being negative about eco-villages, but I wouldn't describe it as an object. I think that's part of regeneration, is that we stop thinking about things as object, as finished things. How can you make it? Give me the blueprint and then I'll scale it out or up or whatever. It's a process. It's a process of living the question of how do we belong? How do we fit? How can we be of healing and regenerative presence in place? And it can happen anywhere. Okay, I'll get off my hobby horse, sorry.
Thank you, Daniel. Let's go to you, Taisa.
I was going to ask Daniel to just continue because that's so inspiring. But yeah, I agree that it is a process. And my question would be, how can we support nature and people to stay healthy and create more collaboration and support each other? And I don't have the answers, but I usually learn by experience, and I love inspiring examples. So I know what to do when I have to act. So I think we can't think it as something isolated. We need to have this like systemic view, and how can we really create systems that will support life to go on.
Mm-hmm.
I would jump in on that and say I agree with both things that have been said. I'd also toss a curveball at that and say that I think that for me, what I think really create these regenerative communities, and from my work and what I've seen, it's truly the people that are in these spaces that have decided to do X. And I'll use the example that's most relevant to me, and that's African Americans in the US who in the South post Civil War and during Reconstruction had pockets of regenerative communities. But due to power structures, those folks were displaced, killed, and told that they had to leave those spaces and those systems to go work to do X, versus having the opportunity to continue building those up. So I'd add people, and I'd say I reframe, I think, what Taisa said, because I think it was spot on, but I'd add that how can people dismantle these power structures that make regenerative communities seem so far-fetched or difficult to attain.
Wonderful answers. And going off of that point about power, which I think is also especially relevant to this conversation and the summit in general, and just the moment in time that we find ourselves in, what would be, in your mind, a critical intervention point in dismantling these extractive power systems? Power doesn't have to be an inherently bad thing. If shared, if distributed in a good way, power can be regenerative. So what would be, in your mind, these acupressure points? I think that's language that you've used in your writing, Daniel, or intervention places to transform power in this time. And feel free to riff off of that question. I'm just going with what I've picking up. Yeah.
Increasingly, I mean, I've learned a lot about the kind of depth of what is regeneration and how is it different, like how is it really a different way of thinking from like Carol Samford and the people at Regenerative group. And one of the things they say is that it's like we need to shift into looking at potential rather than problems, because problems end up inviting us to think about abstract solutions, like using our intellect to describe the problem more and more in detail and then find solutions. And then we want to implement the solutions in lots of places, but we lose the fitting to each place because we think we have the one solution that now just needs to be scaled up. And if you turn it around and you say, no, we need to actually co-create and learn in the process. And it starts with our own learning and our capacity building as a community, as a group, as people in place. And we do so not just learning from each other, but we do so really learning from this place, from the story of place and how we're connected, how we can regrow the roots and the mycelium that was in the beautiful poem at the beginning. How can we connect into that? And that process to me is a process that is really a process of coming home, of like the poet Gary Snyder called it re-inhabitation, of re-inhabiting the earth. And he said a beautiful thing in this poem that in this I think it was actually a talk in 1977, where he ends this talk about re-inhabitation by saying, in order to become re-inhabitory, we have to make ourselves common with the habitatory people and the peasants of this world. And that's where I feel that the power thing comes in, where we have to understand that the place to really transform the system is by building the local and regional structures again that make us not independent or self-sufficient, because we're living in an interconnected planet and we have responsibility for people in all places being able to do so. We have to continue to learn and exchange and all that. But if we really learn how to become living, not just living well in place, doing good to place, planting lots of trees, like Carol Samford speaks of these 4 modern paradigms: extract value, arrest disorder, do good. And lots of people think do good means regeneration, and it doesn't. Or build capacity and regenerate life. And that this process of building capacity again is much more about teaching people in place a new way of coming together in all their diversity across all different divides that currently run so deep in our society, and make the way that we can come together a coming home to place together, to really understand our place again, to the point that we stop identifying so much with all these labels that currently keep us apart. And we begin to identify with place as place, because that's what we could learn from our indigenous elders. Our indigenous elders never believed that the place belonged to them. They always believed that that they belonged to the place. And for me, creating regenerative communities or regenerative cultures is really all about that journey of living the questions together of how can we become healing expressions of this place. And that's where our power lies. If we do that, we can heal the earth, but we can't heal the earth as an abstract problem in COP26 through carbon counting.
Wonderful. And I'm going to take this over to you, Olivia, to acknowledge the regional place-based work that you're doing with the Forbes funds, and also offer you more space to reflect back on this conversation around power.
Absolutely, and thank you for that. I agree with what Daniel said. One of the things that we in the Forbes funds do, and just to give you background on the Forbes funds, is that we're an intermediary foundation that works with about 2,500 nonprofits in southwestern Pennsylvania in the States. So if you look at Pennsylvania in a map, we are the bottom, if you're looking at it, the bottom left corner of the state, and that's really where our work is centered. Specifically in thinking, I'll hug this again and say, we've found that overwhelmingly, like, adopting an equity lens to our work has transformed how we've been able to not only support as a funder the work that folks are doing directly on the ground, but also think through how we have these silos where work is happening and no one is talking to one another. And that creates a framework that people are working around each other instead of with one another. We've also reframed how the language that as a sector we talk about communities. We typically talk at them and we tell them what they need to do versus realizing that the power is centered in the place and with the people there, and changing that. I think it's Travian Shorters who does Black male empowerment, who talks about asset framing and really rethinking how folks are having conversations about what they're doing and what they want to do. So I'll anchor all of this in saying I agree with what Daniel said and what's been said in the chat, but there's a poltergeist here, I think, that we miss, and that's this discussion that there is a lot of trauma and a lot of healing in communities that we do not talk about, and we gloss over and we say, well, that happened 25 years ago or 400 years ago or 250 years ago, and folks should get over it and move toward the space of being more collaborative. But there's so much pain there that I think until that place-based pain, unfortunately, is acknowledged, those silos will exist. So for me, we at the Forbes Funds, we talk about looking for collaborators to help not only address the pain that exists within communities, but also reframe how folks are living now to really get back to the roots and really get back to belonging to the place versus just being a part of it.
Thank you for that. I'm going to take that over to you, Thaisa, to talk about place-based work, power, whatever else you'd like to add on based on the comments from Olivia and Daniel in the chat.
Thank you, Jess. Yeah, I think I will start with the inner work that is really needed at this point. How can, like, each one of us can start with ourselves, and somehow, like, these power structures are all over. And I always hear people complaining about it, but we need to understand that we are the ones supporting these structures, even though we don't want it. So I think we have to be really creative in doing things differently. And I agree, we need to start with this inner work. There's a lot of trauma work to do, and it's important to work like locally, because otherwise it gets so big that we get stuck. So in Gen and in the eco villages all over, there's a lot of work in this sense of being as participatory as process and looking into the power structures. And like there are nowadays so many tools to try out, but of course, like it is a process and it's a more like mid-term, long-term process until we can really succeed. So yeah, I've seen very good examples on how communities are creating different realities in a really kind of horizontal structure, like where each one is heard and they have the same voice and contribution. But I've also seen, unfortunately, there's a lot of these power issues that are still happening on and on. So I think we need to, this is something we need to keep working on and trying something different. And yeah, there are these invisible power structure, and I think like each one of us, we are so powerful when we have to decide. Like there are so many ways to empower ourselves and do things differently. And I think somehow to just try something different and really look into these places where we get kind of trapped in. Yeah, I guess that's it.
I really appreciate this, the acknowledgement of trauma healing, collective trauma, and place-based, people-based trauma. And I'd like to ask each of you, in your own life, in your own world, how do you talk to your own loved ones about the work that you do? Thais, let me hand it back to you for this one. How do you talk to your loved ones about what you do?
About my work?
Yes. What kinds of conversations do you have, each of you, with your friends, your loved ones, your family, about what you're doing, about your work?
I think I'm very proud of my work, and I talk a lot about it, and I think they somehow like follow my adventures and experiences traveling from communities in the global South and also in the global North. And yeah, I think it's just, sharing experiences and telling them how it's important to me and how I see it's important for the future generations that we connect. And usually they are always curious and very much willing to learn more. I also work a lot with education. And I think it's central if we want to do like this great transition. How can we frame things differently, and we put together like inspiring examples from the ground. And like, for example, I learn a lot with indigenous communities in Brazil, and it's beautiful to see that they knew everything like for so long. Usually when they are going to introduce themselves, they start with the name of the tribe. And then if you ask again, they will tell you their name, the personal name. because what is important is the tribe, the community, and the place where they belong to. And like they talk about home, like home is the forest, is nature, is everything around. And many of us, we talk about home as the like a small square we live. So I think there's a lot of learnings in communities, and I love to come and go and to learn with them, to be able to share. That's my work. And in Gen, I'm now working as the education coordinator, and I travel through communities and teach about eco-village design. That I'm very much inspired by the eco-villages and the work they are doing. So eco-villages are living laboratories of another way of living. So they are pioneering appropriate technologies and also social different ways of being together, and another worldview and economic different systems, local systems. So yeah, that's my work, and that's I'm usually very happy to share about it.
Thank you, Taisa. Anyone, just feel free to jump in, Olivia or Daniel.
Yeah, I can jump in. I've made my work and me are not separate. So we've essentially kind of just, it's become who I am. So friends, family, partner, spouse, just recognize that if you're with me in this journey, we're going to do this work together. I don't necessarily want another ally. I need an accomplice. And so I've really kind of used that as a framing to connect with friends and family and explain what I do. I also found that even for the folks that may not get it from me talking about it, or the way I communicate it, it's not relevant, they can see what's happening around us. So if we, again, just speaking about the US where I'm from and thinking about how there are parts of Louisiana that are still underwater, and it's still hurricane season, and these are places that were habitable years ago, but with the increase of climate change, these are no longer habitable places. And thinking about how there's stronger movements really to get back to just roots, both personally and with the earth, that connects to the work that I'm doing. So being able to show those examples and highlight the work that's happening around the world and that's very visible to folks, they're able to connect with it and say, okay, Olivia, like, I think I get it. Like, I think what you told me 2.5 years ago finally makes sense. So yes, I am 30 months behind in that conversation, but you can't do this work alone. So you have to find those accomplices, and mine right now are friends and family.
Do you want me to go next?
Sure.
Elisa, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I was also going to say this, that the whole thing of separating life and work is not something that I really do anymore. Like, I always find it strange when people talk about work-life balance, because it sort of seems to suggest that they're not alive when they're working. And I really, like, my partner has probably suffered me passionately talking about my work for the last 25 years, but she's still with me, so it can't be that boring. And in many ways, I've tried to communicate this in different ways over the last 20 years. And initially, it was more academic, and so I wrote this 750-page PhD thesis on design for human and planetary health in 2006. And was a little bit surprised that nobody read 750 pages. I don't know why they didn't. And I spent all this time writing it and nobody read it. And then I felt like it needed applying. And so I spent a lot of time living in an eco-village in Findhorn and working with the United Nations, working with Gaia Education and the Global Eco-Village Network, known Taisa for many, many years. We've crossed paths through the eco-village movement. And then my book, Designing Regenerative Cultures, is another way of trying to communicate my passion about this work. Thank you for holding it up. You've got all the right books on your desk, Galen. Well prepared. And yeah, and since then, I've realized that actually even writing that book wasn't enough, that you needed to give the book away for free on the internet through Medium, through Facebook, through Twitter, and actually keep the content moving in order for people to find out about it. Otherwise, it would have been another one of those cases that nobody would have read it. And right now, I'm personally feeling that the most powerful form of communicating my work that I'm beginning to rediscover, which is kind of a long journey of 20 years coming back to getting my hands dirty in the soil, is that I've now found a place where I can actually heal the ground that I'm the custodian of, and I can plant the trees, and I can live in more detail the life through. I just bought myself a solar cooker and starting to get into cooking directly off the sun without any need for electricity or wood or any of that. But it's these little steps to actually begin to live in a day-to-day way, not just with myself, but also with my neighbors, what regenerative community means. And the big insight that I'm learning through that is that we can't do all the scales at once. It's not so easy to really take a deep dive on the land and really do the community-owned renewable energy microgrid with my neighbors. That's a lot of work to organize all that. And if I do that, then I can't be on 15 webinars in a month. And so it's making these choices and learning where communication makes a difference, and how do we speak about our work, or is it not better to actually live our work and be an example? Anyway, sorry, I kind of got off track a little bit, but thanks for the question.
Don't have to stay on any kind of tracks around here. Jess, I'll hand it to you.
Thanks, Elisa. So given all of the concern and uncertainty for our future, what are the guiding lights or bright possibilities for building regenerative communities that you're most invested in right now? And think of this as an invitation to describe your work right now. What are you doing in your day-to-day to build regenerative communities? And I'll hand that over to you, Olivia, to start.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'd say there's a couple of things that we've done, and I will go back to what I said earlier about adopting an equity focus to our work. For lack of better terms, we gave communities money to do what they wanted to do with the partners that were at the table, and said, you decide how you want to spend this money. We trust you. Which in philanthropy is very rarely will there be that level of, there are no other words but trust, right? Like trust and saying like, yes, you know your community better than I do. You are here. You know the intricacies and what's needed. So we're going to give you money to do just that. And we're going to reduce the burden on some of those reporting requirements that we have, and we will be at the table to help collaborate with you versus preach on how you should do X. So I'd say from philanthropy, that's one thing that we've done. The second is focus on building the capacity of folks that are in communities to do the work that they want to do, but whatever hurdle there is, they may not be able to do it. So how do we ask them and figure out what do they need, and let's fund and give folks what they need, again, versus being very parental in philanthropy. Those are two things that I think we are working through and working on and invested in. And yes, they've been clunky. Yes, we've learned lessons. Yes, and I think those are good. The second is connecting those communities and saying that, you know, the work that you're doing here may not be completely relevant to what another community is looking for, another space, but you should share learnings. We should talk to one another, because if we don't communicate and we don't talk and we don't find ways to not even share best practices, but just share and really, as I mentioned earlier, break down silos, we run the risk of not making progress or building accomplices and allies in spaces that could be, because folks just don't know. So those are the 2.5-ish things that we're working on.
Awesome. I'll pass it over to you, Thaisa.
Thank you. I'm doing many things at the same time, as always, but I'm just organizing another Eco-Village Design Education online program. I'm also, in my work in Gen, I'm working with many researchers, and I think this is really important. I remember when I got back to the university to study eco-villages in my master's, like at least in Brazil, there was like nothing, or let's say like 5 papers about it in Portuguese. And I'm amazed to see how the interest has grown. So now more and more people are willing to do research about communities and like transition initiatives, eco-villages, and so on. And I'm coordinating a group of researchers and organizing a monthly research colloquium in Gen, and to spread the word. And now we got a special edition in Springer about eco-villages and community-led initiatives, and what is their work in relation to climate change. And I think that's super nice. Another thing that I'm doing is with education, that I feel we need to work more, or let's say to support more children and youth. So I started working with schools, community schools, and also schools that are interested in using the, let's say, the eco-village approach. And we are cross-pollinating the learnings from these schools, and also co-developing tools and materials to support youth facilitators, formal and informal educators, to work with this more, let's say, this towards regeneration approach. What else? I'm also working in many partnership projects, building collaboration with not only universities, but municipalities, local authorities. I think like in the beginning, the eco-villages were more closed in like this community environment. And nowadays, the idea is to connect to more and more to their regions and bioregions, and to work together hand by hand. How can we support each other in this transition? And that's something I really like to learn about and to spread. So these are the main projects in Gen. We are working also we just concluded a huge work in a new eco-village impact assessment, and now communities from all over the globe are like filling in the assessment, and we hope to very soon be able to share results. And because it was common to get into like these events and talk about how inspiring eco-villages are, at least to me. And then people, oh, okay, it seems nice, but what are the numbers? Like many people still like the numbers and this kind of hard data. So we are putting together some of these to compose with our like qualitative data. And this is part of my work. Also teaching a lot online.
Thank you, Thaisa. I'm going to pass it over to you, Daniel.
I'm kind of in a bit of a transition of trying to get away from doing too many things at once. Like I've already alluded to it a couple of times, this desire to do more work in place, work with people who are immediately live either as my neighbors or on the same island that I live in, Mallorca, and beginning to really, I moved to Mallorca 10 years ago, 11 years ago, because I saw that as an island, it was a great test field for doing bioregional scale regeneration work, and not from a sort of master plan, let's build a fancy website and say, I'm going to regenerate Mallorca and get lots of people to put their logos on the website, but really just starting a conversation and beginning to kind of weave existing initiatives into more proximity. But that's been a passion of mine, but it's never been how I've earned my living. And right now, my attention is still too much with working as a consultant, working as an educator internationally, working through social media, giving talks and webinars and all those kind of things. And I actually feel a real need to stay in congruence and integrity with my work, to somehow begin to balance it more towards living the regenerative practice in a day-to-day way. And so my hope is that I'm going to do less work online and maybe find time to write my next book, but precisely about the process of how I'm engaging with the land and the community. But just to name a couple of things that, because I find it hard to say no, and so I end up in lots of projects anyway, despite that intention. So one interesting project that people might be interested in is that ETH Zurich is the Eidgenössische Technische Hochschule, but they're doing it in English, are launching a MOOC, a massive open online course on designing regenerative and resilient systems in the beginning of next year. And I've been helping them build some of the content for that course, and MOOCs are generally free, so it's a nice way of sharing some pretty, like it's going to be an interesting course. And another thing, because I really loved what Olivia was saying about the way that the Forbes Fund is funding in the area that you're working in, because working with Spring Prize, which is, I now don't work on the jury anymore. I stepped down from the jury, but for a couple of years I was on the jury for the Lush Spring Prize in regeneration, social and ecological regeneration. And anybody who's out there, any of you on this call, if you have a little project that you want to make happen, the amazing thing about the Lush Spring Prize is that one of the categories is intentional projects. So with a good write-up and a little team, you can actually get, I think it's £10,000 for an idea. And that's unusual with funders. And out of the somewhat frustration that we had as the jury, being able to give away £210,000 to 11 projects once a year, now it's once every 2 years, we developed this project, which is now turned into, that's also a website people might enjoy looking at, regenerosity.earth, I think it is. And it's the same type of, because there's a structural mismatch with the way that the funding industry, with best intention, tries to fund regeneration. Funders for most larger funders, 500,000 is a tiny fund that doesn't even go to the board, that just some regional worker gets okay to sign that off. And for most regenerative projects, if they were given 50 grand over 10 years, once a year, they could do amazing work with it. And so what this Regenerosity platform, and some of it is described on it, is trying to do is to help this process of bringing funding to small grassroots projects, rather than getting the funders all excited about yet another $5 million all bling high-tech regenerative community somewhere in the world. Like that's not, like, I think that the job is not to build new blingy eco-villages or examples. The job is to transform existing community into a regenerative community, and that needs a different kind of funding. And again, I've veered off a little bit, but I'll shut up now.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm going to pass it over to you, Elisa, to see if you'd like to ask one more question before we shift into panelists-led question, where you can ask questions of one another. Elisa.
Okay. Well, I've often in the past year or so, we've been thinking together in the movement about where the power structures lie and how to, where we need to make these shifts happen. So I want to ask you, in terms of where shifts can happen, it was in the past very much focused on to get away from fossil fuels, and we still talk about that. And now there's in terms of funding, in terms of technology, there is such a push for data, and some people have said data is the new oil. I can see that it's very it can be very tempting to collect numbers and gather data, or even to sell data in order to come up with the funds to do a project. What do each of you see as the role of, or as your own role? How do you navigate making decisions about where data mining is happening, or where there's extractive data gathering, or harmful technologies, or even technocracy, versus making decisions that that might be beneficial, or where's the gray area for you where it's unknown? Well, just any of your thoughts on all that. Whoever would like to go first, jump in.
Shall I?
Go for it, Daniel.
This is quite a, and you just opened the can of worms a little bit.
Yes.
Because don't even know where to start. I had a fascinating, very aligned to creating regenerative community, coming back to place, helping local communities. One of my long-term friends and mentors, Helena Norberg Hodge, started a couple of years ago a World Localization Day. And last year, wait a minute, where are we in this year? It was this year even. Celebrating it, she asked me on a webinar to join this panel, and there was a woman called Camila Moreno, who's Brazilian, who now is doing some postdoctoral work in Berlin at the Humboldt University. And she pointed out something that I hadn't clicked to me, is that she said that the whole digitalization and data edifice agenda is a twin agenda with the carbon agenda, in terms of carbon metrics and breaking everything down to carbon, that cognitively leaves you only one possible solution of how to tackle climate change, which is large corporations that can handle the computing power and the data and the crunching, with large states coming into some sort of alignment, and all community-led. And she wrote this amazing paper which you can get free online. If you look at Heinrich Böll-Stift and Camila Moreno, I think it's called Carbon Metrics, and then something, an epistemicide, because she's making the point that this kind of way of seeing things is actually shifting us out of giving true value to the kind of place-grounded, place-sourced regenerative work that our indigenous elders have done for generations. Otherwise we wouldn't be here. Like, reiterate that again, regenerative cultures is nothing new. We wouldn't have got here if we hadn't known how to live as regenerative cultures in a bioregional context as custodians of the ecosystems that we depended on for most of our species history. The aberration is all this data mining and this edifice of artificial, and the problem is that we believe the self-fulfilling prophecy of runaway tech, that, oh, it's out of the box, we just have to run along with it, and we need to make technology serve us. And while I know lots of wonderful people in the holochain movement and in the seed movement and whatever who really care, and the guys from Regen Network, but I personally still think behind all that is a deeper conversation about when to use what technology to what extent, and how do we make the technology serve us again rather than become servants of technology. So it's, thanks for pricking that little bubble for me, because I think it's a really important topic.
Thank you, Daniel. Olivia, your thoughts?
So first hat as, you know, a funder, I would say that funders love data. Any sort of data, we love data because we've, in some cases, used that data to determine impact, and if something is a funding priority. And I would push back on that, and I think the Forbes Funds tries to push back on that and says that data is one piece of a larger story, and it's a beautiful story, but it's one piece of a story. But we know that there are a number of people that aren't counted in that data. So, and by that, what I mean is that if you right now have access to internet and you have access to a computer, you can learn almost anything you want because it's at your fingertips. But if you do not have that access, you're pulled out of that conversation and you can't participate in things that happen. You can participate, right, but you have to participate in a different way. So at the Forbes Funds, I can say data is one piece of the story, but we've also really had these really intriguing conversations with our partners in communities on not so much that if you need to make tech work for you, but how do you own your data, and how do you own the points that are coming out about your community, for lack of a better term. And most folks that we've talked to will say that, and again, not to generalize things, but a number of people that we talk to will say that, this tells one piece of the story, but not all pieces of the story. And we're really not interested in being another case study for a corporate social responsibility project. So for us, at least, it's an interesting dynamic. I think one that we are working to figure out what our relationship as a funder from one hat with data looks like, but also as a community partner as well.
And Tyson.
Yeah, I don't have so much to add to this topic. I think, like, in my work, I learned how sometimes it's important to put together some data to share, so you can like try to prove or what you want. But I personally, like, yeah, in terms of technology, it's super useful sometimes, but on the other hand, it can be really, let's say, it can reveal how unequal our structures can be. So at least in the Brazilian communities during the COVID pandemic, we could see like all the schools were closed and people need like digital access. And many times it was like one mobile for more than 10 like young guys to attend school online, and that's really bizarre. And so how it brings more separation, and I can see also in the courses I teach, I think now people are getting more and more used to technology, but sometimes we just give up using some amazing tools because I would lose part of the group. They don't know how to use the tools. They are not really it's not so friendly to them, all these technologies. So I'm grateful, because otherwise we would not be here, for example, with 115 people from I don't know where. It's useful, but I'm very careful on how to use it, because I like to be inclusive in terms of technology. And in terms of data, it's just like I'm curious as a research to gather like specific type of data, but I'm not like, I can't talk about like this in a bigger picture. Daniel.
I just feel we need to add like what kind of data are we talking about, and bring in Nora Bateson and warm data, and the need for qualitative kind of much more subtle data that isn't captured by statistics. I think one thing that the pandemic and all that has showed us is how there's a lot of range between one outlier and another, and the medium in the middle in a statistical medium. It's the same like when somebody tells you that your mother has terminal cancer and they say statistical medium survival rate is 6 months. You will hope and you will pray for that case to be 3 or 4 years. And it happens, those miracles happen, or even recovery happens. And so it can be devastating for somebody to be told there's only 6 months because the idea of the miracle goes. And so I find we need to watch out that there's a sort of dictatorship of hard data and hard science that still pretends that science is actually able to predict and control the world as is. And science can give us a lot of really useful stuff. And I'm not talking against science. And somebody said local data is really important. But that's actually what triggered me to say, let's talk about warm data. Yes, local data is important, but it's not necessarily what's in a hard drive in terms of statistical data that was collected by some kind of probe, but it's knowing when the birds arrive to breed, knowing when the rains come, knowing over long periods of times that this area floods every 60 years. There's a sort of storyline data that we've lost and are unable to connect to. And again, it's both and. Let's do the quantitative focused scientific data journey, but let's also give value to other forms of knowing that don't run on statistical significance. I mean, that's why I left science, because I was just fed up that anything that can't be expressed in a p-value wasn't there in behavioral science of marine mammals. Anyway.
Yes. Warm data is definitely something that the Forbes Fund has been working with. I'm just recalling, I'm also a participant in the Forbes Fund's anti-racism year-long training cohort, and that's been just an amazing experience. And all of the points brought forward about data have been really important. I just wanted to drop a link to the Center for Humane Technology. They're the ones who I believe helped produce The Social Dilemma, the documentary kind of going into the social media platforms. So yeah, reassessing our relationship to data is essential and key. Acknowledging that science and knowledge exists in different places beyond that which has been defined by the Western colonized view of the world is critical. I could go on. This is really juicy and exciting. I want to actually give an opportunity to our panelists to think about some questions you might want to ask of each other, and then we'll shift into a larger Q&A session. I see that some questions have been placed in the chat. I'm sure you all have been digesting a lot of amazing thoughts here and would want to create space to share that. But yeah, I'm going to open up the floor to our panelists. What questions would you like to ask of one another? And we'll go from there.
And or just feel free to continue the conversation amongst yourselves, the three of you.
Yeah.
I have one for Taisa. Taisa has just mentioned this online EDE course that she's organizing, and she's like, she invited me to teach on the previous one, and kind of to almost sort of saving grace of some of these technologies. We both know how a song, literally a song and a dance and a get your hands dirty, on like face-to-face in an eco-village 4-week immersive course in eco-village design education, as we've taught them in many places, Taisa and I. But how was it to try to bring, because I briefly talked to you when we had our session, and you said that you actually managed to get a globally asynchronous cohort to gel like a tribe. Tell us a little bit more about using technology for the good.
I will tell a little bit, and then I will open the mic because there are some previous participants around, so you can hear from them. But it was really an interesting experience. At the beginning, I was kind of a little bit afraid. Wow, is it going to work? And at the end, I was super grateful. We had, like, because it was online, we had 70 participants from all over the globe, like people waking up at 5 a.m. to join, and people staying up until midnight to join from New Zealand, the others from Hawaii and California, and people from all continents, like many Latin American countries, many African countries, all over Europe, many countries from Asia. And so there was something, technology supported us. And I was really impressed to see how we could create community online and very fast. Like in, let's say, in 2 sessions, we were a community and we had such a beautiful journey. I'm very proud of it. And that's why we are going for the next one, because the pilot experience was amazing. And of course, we had like amazing guest trainers also from all over. And yeah, maybe you could add to that, Helen. I can see you here. How was to be part of that journey?
It was amazing. And I'll tell you, it is still amazing because 2 groups are still working together. One working with Kejosi in the refugee camp in Kenya, and another one working on the game Return to Gaia, which was inspired by all your work. And of course, we were so lucky to have fabulous people like Daniel. Hi, Daniel. Join us for the courses, just really inspiring. And yes, we are a community, and I can tell you, if you hadn't done it online, I could never have afforded to travel to Italy or South America and take part in this. So it has enriched my life immeasurably. Thank you, and keep it up.
Thank you. Over to you, Jess. Oh, now it's between us.
Between us, yeah, we'd like to ask each other some more questions. There was some thoughts.
I have a question for Olivia. Did I understand right that the area you work in is just as corner of southwestern Pennsylvania, or is the Forbes Fund also wider in the US and in other parts of the world?
No, I'd say 90% of our work is just in southwestern Pennsylvania. What we've been doing recently, though, is connecting with organizations as just mentioned, through the anti-racism cohort and other folks around the globe and the world, really thinking about how we kind of tackle problems, bringing in partners from all over.
And I'm going to really be daring, because it's I recently wrote a piece, I actually shared it earlier, that there was also, it felt like I was leaning myself out the window by saying we're all indigenous to life, because I've seen and I've been hurt a little bit by the conversation around indigeneity, where it becomes an othering again, like rather than recognizing that we all are of this earth, and that we all were indigenous to place at some point in our history. And the trauma and violation for many people in Europe started with the witch burnings, and are also still in the people. But how would you, in a similar way as the truly listening, bringing in and understanding that if we want to be place sourced and regenerative, we need participation. Is not just a fancy word. We need it. We need people in place to have the capacity to move into the future, and that means everyone. But how do we work with the trauma that you rightfully brought into the room, and not let it continue to separate us? How do we truly heal it in such a way that we don't end up in positions where just by default, because for 500 years, white guys like me in this phase of life had far too much to say, for the next 500 years, that demographic is just going to have to shut up. I don't think that's where the synthesis would lie. How do you see that? How do we work that healing in a way that we move forward together?
So I'd say a couple of things immediately come to mind. First and foremost is the acknowledgement of that trauma, which in some spaces is just hard to do. Folks, frankly, refuse to acknowledge that, again, in the States, we have a long, violent history, not just against indigenous populations, but folks forcibly brought here and kept in shackles for 400 years, and their descendants. We have that's a violent history, and those systems and structures that did that are still in place. And we have yet to truly acknowledge that through any sort of reparative justice or reparative funding. So again, I think acknowledgement is first. As far as the division, I would push, maybe not back on that, but I'd push kind of around that. And I'd say there is absolutely division amongst folks that refuse to acknowledge that these historical traumas have taken place, and there needs to be healing to deal with those. Though that's the divisive side. The side of the oppressed, in my opinion, hasn't said anything different over 500-600 years at this point. But it's just that other side that's saying, okay, well, by you not accepting that I will not acknowledge this, you're being divisive, and that's not really the case. So I push and say, like, maybe there's a framing there that I'd like to challenge. The other thing I'd say is that there are general commonalities amongst us all. Like, we're all here, we all look differently. No one, I guess it's a rectangle on my screen, looks the same, but we all have different lived experiences that we're bringing to the table. And your lived experience, Daniel, and yours, you know, and mine, and Jess's, and anyone else's, will all have some validity. But in this space, when we're talking about regenerative communities and regenerative places and people and the resilience of communities, we have to acknowledge the warm data there, right? The interconnectedness in that play. That's not necessarily visible, but you have to peel back the layers to get to that contextual conversation.
That's amazing. Thank you, Olivia. Want to start to open up questions and also make space for you, Thaisa, to see if there's anything you'd like to add. Then we'll move into a larger Q&A session. again have questions in the chat waiting, and feel free to add more, folks, if you have any other questions you'd like to ask of our panelists.
Yeah, I would like to ask a question to Olivia because we just got to know each other. We're still getting to know each other in this conversation. I would like to know more about your work at the Forbes Fund. And I don't know if you work just inside the US or if there's any like experience in Latin America or in African countries.
Thank you. So right now we work all in the US. That's really been our focus, has been with building capacity for nonprofit organizations. Recently, as I mentioned earlier, we adopted an equity lens to our work. So we've been on the ground really working with those smaller organizations that frankly have been doing amazing things. But they have not been supported, and leaders are dealing with unprecedented levels of stress. And you know, the global pandemic sucks, right? Like, it's terrible, but the other things that's revealed, I think, are terrifying, specifically in the fact that we have populations that have just been disenfranchised and pushed to the side. And we talk about these groups as though you know, their resilience and their grit is something to be championed, versus saying, well, how did we get to these points, these power structures where folks are literally just surviving and have no hope of thriving, and we want to applaud their struggle as if that's, you know, thank you for your struggle, thank you for doing all of this work, but we don't want to fund it. So anyway, I won't go down that tangent, but we've really focused on that. And I think under the leadership of Fred, our president and CEO, we really thought about our role, not just locally, but how we are connecting with our global brothers and sisters around doing this work, and sharing best practices that we can bring, you know, here to Pittsburgh to our partners, but also share out.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to start to take a look at some of the questions in the chat. Let's see.
Thanks to everyone who's been participating and chiming in here in the chat all along.
Thank you.
We have many, many questions and comments and links people have shared.
So the one question I'm seeing from William, how do we welcome folks into conversations like this when their tech may not be adequate to our baseline requirements? So going back to that accessibility question around technology,
I can start at least. We have used it a lot in Brazil, and I do a lot of work also in some African countries, and I also had the same experience in Mozambique. So if one person has access, you just open a kind of hub and invite your neighbors, your community to join. It was more tricky during the pandemic, but we managed to do things here in Brazil and also in Mozambique with these hubs in kind of open air spaces where people could get together and see in a big screen and participate with the support of the ones who could manage and afford that. So that's one way of doing it. And some organizations are supporting like young people to get, let's say, old mobiles so they can connect through the mobile, as it's so expensive for them to afford it in Brazil and Latin America for sure.
Yeah, I'd add to that and say, you know, at the Forbes Funds, we started doing, we call them our weekly call for community solutions. So every week, every week on a Monday, we bring on nonprofit folks and we talk challenge and bring on folks that are working on solutions. But we've noticed that there's a large chunk of folks that, just aren't able to tap into that. So we've worked with what we call kind of a return on relationships. So how do we provide information to individuals to also share out? And how is that information, not in like tech speak or like philanthropic jargon, but what are the nuts and bolts of what we're trying to say? And using that contact or that person that's doing great work in communities to really share that out, but also share back feedback. Are they hearing things that the sector is doing that just doesn't work for folks? And how could that change? And I think the pandemic has, there was always a digital divide, if such, but there was also, it almost, I don't know, it felt kind of intentional at some point, like we were purposefully leaving folks out. So we had to shift the way we were doing work to make sure that we were not just making things available, but being as accessible as we can be, knowing that we still need to improve.
Daniel, would you like to respond to the question? We can go to the next one.
I think I don't need to. It's a very important question, but I don't really have anything significant to add.
So I have a question here from Rua and Lewis. How do we guide people into radical change given the urgencies we face? The clock is ticking and there's more talk than action. How would you all respond to that question?
I briefly go. I think there's a dangerous false dualism here. Of course, we need action. We don't need to just blah, blah, blah. But the very act of engaging with other people in talking about this is already having agency in the world. I think we misunderstand how important it is also to engage with each other in this process of what some people would call, oh, you've just sat around and talked. But for an indigenous community, being in council is not just taking 2 hours out to talk and then you go and do things. The council is doing things. And I think if we realize that we all change the world every second through the way we behave, and if we redefine activism as how do I activate a storyline through the power of my intention and through choosing where I'm standing in this story and how I'm seeing it, that is the butterfly effect. That's how we can actually change the world. And the interesting thing about this is sort of pseudoscientific story of the butterfly effect is that it's the butterfly flapping its wings that causes the big cyclone somewhere else, the thunderstorm, but it's not the other way around. So it's not from the global big thing to the small, it's the small causing the large. And I think we all have that power to choose every day, what story do I stand in, how do I live it? And of course, many of us, me absolutely included, have privileges over others who have a lot less power to choose. That also has to be said. But the power to choose is always there to some extent of, do I still engage? Do I give up? Do I try to be part of some form of transformation? And we're in the middle of it. It's changing us, whether we want it or not. And we're changing it.
Thaisa or Olivia, make some space for you to respond to the question if you'd like.
Yeah, I would agree with Daniel. I'd also say one of the things that I've tried to do is if I think about changing the world, like I'll go sit in a dark room and cry because it feels dark and overwhelming. And there's no way that any of that can happen. If I think about changing other people, I have maybe a fear of shattering relationships that exist. But if I think about how I can change myself, then it becomes a different framing for me, at least, where I say, okay, well, I'm here in this room with 115 other people having this conversation. And now I've learned from the folks here, and I've gained from that I can go have that conversation with, my friends that I talk about, or family members that are familiar with my work and know that my work is me and I am my work. And then I also, I was just thinking about this, like looking at the chat. That chat is full of so many resources that I did not have before I got on this call today, or this Zoom today. But now I have tools and an arsenal to help drive change, not just internally, but with friends and family. And I know that might not answer your question, but from my perspective, if I think about changing the world, I shut down. If I think about the impact that I can have in Southwestern Pennsylvania and with myself, it becomes much more, it feels much more catalytic.
I felt that. Thaisa, would you like to respond to the question?
I want to hear the question again. Sorry, I was responding to other questions on the chat and I lost it.
So I'll paraphrase. I believe it was that times are urgent, and how do we motivate folks to take action when there's so much urgency? There's a lot of things that are taking their attention right now. We seem to be doing a lot of talking and not taking action. So that was the question, and to reflect on it in whatever way you'd like.
Well, I like to do it, like, I think the way is just do these changes in your life and be an example for other people to get inspired and do it in their lives. I'm more an action person, and yeah, I feel it's super inspiring to get into conversations. But if I'm just in like reading amazing thing or getting into inspiring conversations, at the end I feel quite empty. And when I go and see someone doing something, I feel like, oh, I can do it. We can all do it. Let's do it. So I feel it's yeah, that's my way to do it. And it's always a good advice to start small, start with yourself, in your house, in your community, and then you can expand. But I would try it out, just to do something different, to do something in this direction that you believe it's necessary. Just do it. And that's how I found out about the power of community, because sometimes I feel like I can do nothing by myself, but then if I get together, even with a small group of people, like, we are so powerful together. And the others maybe have the resources that you're missing, and then yeah, you can start doing like more visible things. I remember being part of a transition group in Rio years ago, and it was so beautiful to see. Like, the core group was like really small, but our actions were really like mobilizing the whole neighborhood.
Thank you, Thaisa. Before I go to the last question, yeah, Elisa, I wanted to see if you wanted to bring anything into the conversation.
I do. Thaisa, you just mentioned some of the work you did in transition groups, and I saw that you've done some work with Transition Brasilandia. I would love to know how you or any of you three have worked across people living in very different economic situations, very different racial situations, different levels of oppression, and people with different levels of privilege, different levels of power. have you worked across those? And Thais, if you'd like to share any about that work you did with the transition group, maybe with water harvesting or some of that work you did, please do tell us about that.
Yeah. Brasilândia is a huge favela, a huge slum in São Paulo city. And together with a dear friend, her name is Mônica Picaveia, and she's part of the Brazilian Hub, and Don just asked me about her in the beginning. She was doing a work there, and she decided to invite some of us to get together, and she invited me to, she knows about my work with the Eco Village Design Education Program, and she invited me to support her adapting the EDE to Brazilian slums. And that was a huge adventure back in 2011. And she was trying to fundraise for this project. At the end, there was like no fund, but all the like trainers and supporters that we invited to join were there. And it was amazing. We were working together with a group of leaders in that slum. She identified them during like the years she was working there before, and she was seeing who are the people that can multiply this knowledge. And yeah, it was amazing. We did the EDE course, and right after that, we co-created a transition group inside of the slum. And I know they turned it like there was an empty place that became a square. We planted like many herb gardens around the school, and also they built a Duomo, like a with green building. There was some beautiful construction to inspire people. There was a very nice work with in slums. There's no like roof. It's just like this on top because it's less expensive to build. And so they started to plant on the top of the houses. It was like an amazing experience, and some people from the group started to work together and co-created like social enterprises, and some of them are still active working together. So it was a very inspiring work. I could mention others, but I'll let Daniel and Olivia add to that.
If we get a repeat of the question, I was selfishly responding to things in the chat.
Sure. What have your experiences been like with working with people who come from very different levels of economic situations, or different levels of privilege, different levels of racial oppression? And have you had experiences kind of bringing people together? How do you address those disparities when doing that work?
Yeah, so I'd say that, in our work and my work at the Forbes Fund, the area that we play is really in those intersections of those economic and racial dynamics. And it's a practicing of what I said earlier. We acknowledge not just that trauma, but the things that have happened, that are currently happening while we're having these meetings. Like we don't let the gaslighting take place. If it's a conversation specifically maybe about housing, like we won't let the folks that might be driving the gentrification off the hook. We make them acknowledge that they are playing in that space. I'd say in Fred would, I think, say this too, it's that removing of silos is one thing, right? Like we want folks at the table ideally working together towards driving solutions, but you can't acknowledge, you can't remove those silos until you break the frames on what they're built on. And that's oftentimes, in many cases, racial disparity, racial injustice, lack of equity and lack of equality. And so we hold that space. And I think that's kind of where the, one of the things I mentioned earlier, that warm data comes into play, because that opens up the space to have those conversations, more so just around like the physical pieces of what exists, but also the context of what brought those things to the table and why we're having these discussions. So yeah, I say all that to say it's a process. Every meeting with the Forbes Funds is a process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there sure is so much acknowledgement, healing, trauma work, equity work. There's so much that that calls out to be addressed. Daniel, hand it to you. Any comments on that?
I was just reflecting, like, I've had some wonderful experiences, like, for example, teaching in the first eco-village design education course in Thailand at a place called Wongsanit Ashram, where basically activists from all over Southeast Asia came together for, in this case, it was 6 weeks, to really dive deep into community building. And I had this role of giving a first introductory talk with slides from eco-villages all around the world and about what is an eco-village. And afterwards, one of the village leaders from what is Myanmar, just across the border, came to me and said, "I'm confused now. If what you showed are eco-villages, then all our villages are eco-villages." And in that lies something really deep that is the big gift of the Global Eco-Village Network, which is also to some extent set up by privileged Northerners initially, is that it has created a revindication of what the development discourse has called underdeveloped people. To say, no, in the North, there are lots of people trying to get back to some of the deeper levels of community that you still hold at the center. And so that's one thing that this question made me think of, this bridge building of how can we show that so much we're actually trying to rediscover. But the other thing that thinking about the Forbes Fund for some reason, because Forbes always brings in this idea of lots and lots of money, like the Forbes list and so on. I suddenly reflected on, I've also met some really traumatized people who have shed lots of money, who come from these families that basically mean that they will inherit vast amounts of money and have been groomed into some sort of philanthropic activity from being quite young. But with a lot of them, I feel that there is a bit of sort of not being able to trust anybody around them, that they're genuinely interested in them as human beings. Everybody just wants a piece of their money. And some of them are playing the long game, and some of them immediately do the ask. But it's interesting to think of, to some extent, actually be compassionate about some of people who are so overprivileged that it is actually quite traumatic to have to live with that. And I'm fully aware that there are billions of deeply underprivileged people who have a much harder situation to cope with. But would it not be easier to hold wealthy people if we're actually compassionate about their own trauma of being at the top of the pyramid? I don't know. Question. What do others think? The other panelists think about that?
I mean, I think I don't know. I don't feel like compassion is finite, right? Like I can have compassion for the trauma that someone may face when dealing with the pressures that come from having money and access and privilege. I think where the crux of that comes in, for me at least, it's, well, how are you using that money, access, and privilege to on one frame, maybe, you know, identify the root of that shame and that trauma. But on the second frame, or additional ones, I won't say there's just two, to actually uplift and return. If you're a billionaire, it's about returning, right? Like returning the money that has been siphoned out of communities and places and spaces. So yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. I would just say I don't think, at least for me, my compassion is finite. So I'm willing to do the work, or do some work to acknowledge that trauma. Where I do struggle is building forgiveness off of the backs of the oppressed. I can't give that forgiveness.
Wow. Thank you, Elisa, for offering that really powerful question, and Daniel for that other offering. We're coming to the end of our time together. If you can believe it or not, this has been an especially rich, powerful conversation. And again, the intention with the summit is to take this nourishment, this energy, and to translate it into your work on the ground. So I do want to acknowledge one question that had come in from Marissa. But first, I want to drop into the chat a link to a survey. And I know surveys are not always fun, but this is a really important survey. We put a lot of care and intention into how we designed the summit, and we'd love to hear your feedback about your experience. We're really hoping to carry forward this energy beyond the summit. So it's not just a conference where we're intellectualizing, we're going deep, we're going to keep these relationships alive. And that was the intention behind the use of our Regenerative Communities portal. So I also want to applaud you all for navigating that new experience. I was on a phone call earlier today with someone who needed some support, and he was really appreciative. He's like, this is how we need to do it. We need to support each other. We need to create that space for one another. And it's been a pleasure to hold this space with you, Elisa. And thank you for being my co-host.
Oh, thank you, Jess. Thank you, everyone. And we have a social garden space where you can stay after and keep the talking going. I know my reading list has now gotten another mile long from just all the links that have been shared in the books and the articles. And it is such a joy to get to know and hear from you three, Olivia and Taisa and Daniel, and it's very grateful.
Yes, absolute gratitude. And I want to make some space for any closing comments from our panelists. I feel privileged to have held this space with you all, and again, feel that commitment to action and recognizing that this is important work as well, this relationship building. So back to our panelists. Olivia, any closing comments for us?
I'll be short. I just, offer up gratitude. Thank you all, not just for the conversations, but for your presence here. I'd love in some capacity to stay connected to folks. Not sure how we're going to do that. But I love partnerships, and I love thought partners. And as I mentioned earlier, accomplices in this work. So I offer up my email as a starting point. It's just olivia@forbesfunds.org. And again, I thank you, and I thank my fellow panelists for truly just being, being the change and the good that we all wish to see.
I can go next. Just a lot of appreciation to the Transition US team for organizing this event. And it was lovely to join this conversation with all of you. And thanks for also welcoming a voice from the Global South and for being inclusive. I'm sorry all for my English, for my Brazilian English. I hope it was clear enough.
I love your Brazilian English, Taisa, and it's been a pleasure to be on a panel with you again. Always nice to see old friends and meet new ones. And thanks for everyone who showed up for this. And I'm tired, so I won't stay for the hangout after this. But one thing that I really love just seeing this Transition US event come together is how beautifully you weaving another braid in the movement through eco-villages, through transition towns and the regenerative cultures movement. And we're not trying to create boxes. Like, I've always felt that regenerative cultures are bubbling up through all of these. They're just expressions of. And so I'm just deeply appreciating how the whole movement is basically weaving the inspiration that Rob's last book has given with the what if and the imagination all into a really fertile blend. So wonderful, and congratulations, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you all. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Galen Myers and to Jewel Bystrova to host our social garden hour for any conversations that need to continue here. And again, we invite you to use the Regenerative Communities portal to engage with other summit participants and share knowledge there. Thank you all.